Let's go to tonight's panel. Former Speaker of the House, Bronwyn Bishop, and Sky News host, Caleb Bond. Welcome to you both. Bronwyn, let's start with the editorial. The Newspoll figures that I just spoke about, it's now showing that Peter Dutton is catching up to Albanese. And the key figures that we saw in today's Australian in Newspoll, that Dutton is emerging as a more decisive, a stronger and a tougher leader.
Of course he is. I kept saying that for more than 20 years I sat in that chamber with Albanese and nobody ever said he was leadership material. And he's not. And I think the words that Peter Dutton used today, that he is weak and rattled, is starting to come through. He is searching to try and be liked, to try and be listened to. But every time he opens his mouth and wants to criticise the opposition, people remember that he's lied to us so often. $275 off your electricity bill. We won't change anything about the stage 3 tax cuts. If you go into every aspect of what policies they took, there was no mention ever of the industrial relations reforms that they brought in under the cover of The Voice. So he is in a serious quandary. And Peter Dutton has gone back to the sort of things that people want to hear. Yes, climate change, we've locked into 2050, but no, he won't sacrifice the economy or the people of Australia on the altar of climate change.
I think the point you make, and I talk about it on this show often, because it is just so astonishing that all the commentators wrote about how Albanese was taking this small target agenda to the election. And in fact, we have seen radical nation-changing reform in almost every area, industrial relations, one of them, and none of this was put to the voters. High immigration, again, another thing. But Caleb, I want to ask you about this point that I just spoke about at the start of the show, about the idea, and Simon Benson first wrote about this, the political editor, that Peter Dutton's leadership style suits our times.
Yes.
And it was no secret of the fact that Liberal strategists were trying to get him to soften his image. Now there's no need for that, because voters in a cost of living crisis, when there's lawlessness on our streets, whether it's youth crime or the pro-Palestinian activists, they want a tough leader. His toughness is suiting the times.
Correct. And when you talk about softening the image, fundamentally what you're talking about is likeability.
Exactly.
And Albanese has had a certain level of likeability because, I don't know, they see the likes modern sort of music and he downs a beer at the Marrickville theatre or whatever, right? So he's tried to build an image that says, I'm younger than what my years are. People have liked that. He's still marginally ahead of Dutton in terms of preferred PM. But when it comes down to brass tacks, in times of crisis, people will look for a leader. And Dutton, I think, for a long time has looked like a leader, but it's now that it's really coming into the fore because, as you say, you've got cost of living and plenty of other things to worry about. And it's why, and I hate admitting this, but I've admitted it many times, that Daniel Andrews is one of the best politicians this country has ever seen. And that is because, at a time of crisis, everything that came out of his mouth was nonsense, but he looked like a strong leader. And people believe in a strong leader. And the great quality that Dutton has...
I'm not disagreeing with you, but Daniel Andrews has not had any competition.
No,
the opposition has been weak for such a long time, and it still is.
Correct. But the great thing that Dutton has is that he has that appearance. He stands up. You believe what he says. You know he says it with conviction. And he's now up against a man who looks increasingly more weak. And so people start to go, well, my power bill is going up. Everything is going up. I need someone who can fix it. And Dutton has the conviction and seems convincing enough to be able to do it. That's where he pulls ahead. And there was another poll, Newspoll I think it was, just before Christmas that said a similar thing as well.
Well, the climate wars are now heating up again, and Australians are rolling their eyes because there are so many pressing issues. Anthony Albanese broke the public holiday yesterday to call a snap press conference to put climate change on the agenda, no doubt as a distraction away from the immigration scandal. Well, here was Peter Dutton today on whether he plans to commit to a new 2030 emissions reduction target.
Will you adopt a lower climate target for 2030 than Labor?
Well, as we've said, Labor has no chance of meeting their target by 2030, and I'm going to have a responsible approach, but I'm not going to adopt an approach that sees power prices skyrocketing like they will under Labor.
Does that mean you'll have a lower target than Labor?
Well, it means that we're committed to net zero by 2050.
And here was Anthony Albanese attacking Dutton over those comments.
Peter Dutton is divisive, the coalition are divided, and there's no detail about what they would pursue. They're the 3 Ds of the coalition: divisive, divided, detail, which gives them a big F for fail when it comes to climate policy.
And Bronwyn, just like with The Voice, you know, the cost of living crisis is what most Australians are really battling with. The interest rate rises, the extremely high cost of groceries. You know, do they want another election on climate?
Well, it will be on cost of living. And that's why I've said all along it'll be an early election, because those tax cuts won't last till next May. But if you look at the climate change question, the cost of energy, the cost of electricity feeds into the cost of everything else. It feeds into the cost of the Vegemite in the supermarket. It feeds into the cost of shifting cattle from the pasture to the abattoirs. It feeds into the cost of bringing imports from the wharf to be dealt with. It feeds in at every point, both to inflation and to the cost of living. And so it is part and parcel of that issue. But Peter Dutton has made a very sensible point, that there's no way in the world that the target of the Labor Party is going to be met. It's just another broken promise. Every time he opens his mouth, he breaks a promise, Mr Albanese, Albo the Trot. And Mr Dutton has said very properly that after the election we'll talk about 2030. We're locked into 2050. That'll do. Let's get on with it.
And no doubt Labor will come under pressure from the Teals and the Greens for failing, for being on track, for failing to meet the 2030 targets.
I think they're melding into the same lot, aren't they? Teals and Greens?
They are. Teals, Greens, Labor, all the same to us over here. I joke, but they're not far off. Defence Minister Richard Marles is scrutinising any potential defence shipment to Israel. This story in the Sydney Morning Herald today. He's reportedly trying to make sure that no military equipment is being sent to Israel. And Defence Industry Minister Pat Conroy confirmed that contracts with Israeli companies are for Australian Defence Force equipment. Have a look.
Well, what I can say to you is since the conflict has begun, we've been only approving export permits to Israel for equipment that is returning to Australia for the ADF.
Now, I find this absolutely extraordinary. You have to ask, why would the government have any problem with supplying the democracy of Israel with the ability to defend itself after a terrorist attack? This, Caleb, is so clearly, this is the most blatant sign we've seen yet that Labor is anti-Israel. It doesn't believe Australia should support Israel's efforts to defend itself.
Because what they've done is change the rules. Previously, you could have low-level deals, i.e. they're not worth a huge amount of money, that could be done at a bureaucratic level. Now the Minister, Mr Marles, has decided that all those deals have to go directly to his desk, so he has the power of veto. And the only reason you ask for that power of veto is because you might want to exercise it. I mean, this government has had more flip-flops on the issue of Israel and Palestine than Bondi Beach, to be perfectly frank. Last week you actually felt like, oh, maybe we're getting somewhere. They're taking on the Greens about what's been going on in front of offices. Then we get this week. It changes all the time because we know what they actually think. We know what the Prime Minister thinks. You've shown the clips many times going back into his history. We know what Penny Wong thinks. We know what many members of the Labor left think. But they have to keep up something of a front to look like they actually care about the issue. They don't if you scratch a little below the surface, as the Sydney Morning Herald did in this case. At every turn, they do not want to provide support to Israel. All talk, no action.
What do you think about this, Bronwyn?
Spot on. And every time I look at Mr Marles, having been myself Minister for Defence Industry, Science and Personnel, I just absolutely cringe at the leadership or lack of leadership that's being given. Because just as he buried the helicopters that the Ukraine asked for, or the coal we refused to send them, here he is, as Caleb adequately and beautifully described, usurping a power so that he can deny Israel any support. So,
our ally.
Our
Israel,
ally. He's
ally.
our ally. And we always support our allies. So Mr. Miles, to me, is an absolute pretender. He's the man who sent his speeches off to China to get them checked. He's the man who pretends to spend a lot of money on defence, but that's in 10 years' time, and no money really flows until the end of the forward estimates. He pretends to be concerned, but he isn't. And this is just another example of how he is not living up to our obligations for an ally. The Parliament passed a motion that said Israel had the right to defend itself. That's what the Parliament said.
Well, their actions,
and he is not doing it.
No, and by their actions, they don't support that very statement, because if Israel did want any defence equipment or supplies from us, we wouldn't be supplying it. And partly because of a political issue with the Greens. And you raised China. Well, today the Prime Minister confirmed that we would be having, Australia would be having a visit from the Chinese Premier. We're going to come back to that later in the show, because he was asked about TikTok. Other countries around the world, based on intelligence, are taking action on TikTok. Well, not Albanese. He tried to criticise the journalist for even asking the question. Caleb Bond, Bronwyn Bishop, thank you both so much for joining me.